More than $225 million in fraud was reported by state education departments and school districts from 2019 to 2026, according to a new report. Open the Books, the federal spending watchdog, and the State Financial Officers Foundation analyzed 6 years' worth of reports from the U.S. Department of Education's Office of the Inspector General. The report found multi-million-dollar fraud schemes in school districts all across the country and in American territories. Joining us to talk more about this is the Center Square reporter, Andrew Rice. Andrew, thanks for taking time with us. This, of course, is looking backwards in the past 6 years, quarter of a $billion, $225 million worth of fraud. What's going on here?
Right. Well, Greg, as you mentioned, there was this study conducted analyzing publicly available Inspector General reports through the U.S. Department of Education. The State Financial Officers Foundation and Open the Books looked at these studies going from October of 2019 all the way to March of 2026, so ending just a few months ago. And they found numerous examples, numerous case study examples of high-profile fraud schemes happening in these school systems and in states and even in a territory in the United States. One of the biggest fraud schemes that they saw in terms of just a single amount was a $44 million fraud scheme out of Indiana. This happened where leadership at two virtual private charter schools in Indiana, they overinflated some of their school attendance numbers. And because of that overinflation, they reported students that weren't actually attending. They reported more students than were actually attending, and they got more money from the State Department of Education, from the Federal Department of Education, and assistance to help with that. But really, Greg, what we saw was that was one big example, but this ranged from issues of grants related to student diversity, equity, and inclusion grants, all the way to false tutoring schemes, and then even just even a custodial scam scheme in West Virginia that we saw as well. So really, this ranged these fraud schemes ran the gamut of all these kinds of different actors and systems that didn't stop some of these problems.
Let's take a look. You mentioned the Indiana school district that had $44 million in overpayments, but also West Virginia. A school district there defrauded of $3.4 million. Florida cases totaled $24.7 million. Illinois cases totaled $14.5 million. And even some fraudulent activity down in Puerto Rico for $24 million. What happened in Puerto Rico?
Right. Well, that was one of those that I briefly touched on, but that was one of those false tutoring schemes. So essentially, what happened was several president and several board members in a certain tutoring organization in Puerto Rico falsely claimed that they were providing tutoring services, and so they billed the Puerto Rico Department of Education $24 million for those services. So ultimately, it was 4 individuals that were charged, and these services were never provided. So I think that goes to show, it's not just happening some in the states, but departments of education in U.S. territories like Puerto Rico are also being defrauded through some of these false tutoring schemes and making up records of students that don't exist. No student that was charged through this scheme, what ended up that they charged for in the scheme, was actually tutored.
Chicago Public Schools got hit with something kind of interesting, Andrew, a specific grant that they were found weren't really complying with the actual spirit of this grant. Tell us about that $1 million in Indian education grants.
Right. Yes. So there was $1 million charged to this Indian education grant that was meant to go for American Indian and Native Alaskan students. When the Inspector General looked through this kind of report, they found that these American Indian students were actually, they weren't being provided for. It was actually students of East and South Asian descent that were actually being provided for in this fraud scheme. It was students of Indian descent, Burmese, Bangladeshi, Nepali, and Pakistani descent. More than 1,000 students who said that they identified as Native American, but really were of the South Asian ancestry. School officials, it was found that school officials couldn't verify and, document all of the discrepancies that were going on here. But what I found when I was talking to, some individuals that helped compile this report and some partners at Defending Education, they told me that, these issues come from DEI grants that are provided that don't have an adequate backstop in checking, verifying the actual identities of some of the students that these grants are meant to be provided for. So, that's how it ends, that you have an American Indian and Native Alaskan grant going to most students just of South Asian ancestry.
I mean, did they read Indian grant and think Indian the country, or either way, something that obviously is making some headlines here in this report. Andrew, California, not immune either. The Community Preparatory Academy in California being found $3 million in overpayments for 5 years worth. What happened here?
Right. So this issue at the Community Preparatory Academy in California, this is a charter school. A former head of this school, he pleaded guilty to stealing over $3 million over the course of 5 years. Now, Greg, that $3 million accounts for about a third of all the federal and state grant funding that the school received over that time, according to the Office of the Inspector General. So, it came about that this executive director of the program admitted to using the funds for personal travel, restaurants, shopping online, and private school tuition for their children. The individual also pled guilty to spending more than $200,000 on a Disney Cruise Line vacation and theme park admissions related to those Disney expenses. But when it comes down to this was a small charter school, and $3 million defrauded. It was a smaller charter school, so there's about 330 students at this school, which really showed that these schemes can have a profound impact on a smaller group of students. The State Financial Officers Foundation and Open the Books found that it was about a $9,090 loss per student from this $3 million defrauding scheme over the course of 5 years.
So you can see how just impactful that is when you hear teachers, they'll say every dollar counts in the classroom. So you can imagine those who are upset hearing some of this, thinking that's money that should have gone into the classroom but didn't. Andrew, what are Open the Books and others saying needs to happen here?
Right. Well, Open the Books and the State Financial Officers Foundation. I also spoke with Kimberly Yee. She's the state treasurer in Arizona. They said that, what the U.S. Department of Education is doing right now, shuttering its offices in the Washington, D.C. area, is the right move to address some of this. They called on the Department of Education to use some of its fraud enforcement mechanisms and some of this staffing to really invest it in these state departments of education, because they said, these inspectors that are more on the state level are closer to some of the issues at hand, and they can really more closely monitor and to detect and prevent some of these future fraud schemes.
Andrew Rice, reporter for the Center Square, greatly appreciate you taking time with us here on this Friday, and we'll check back in with you on these and other stories.